What happens when a 9-year-old girl asks a question so profound it leaves an entire town hall speechless, even Donald Trump? Her bravery unlocks a story about faith, loss, and hope that will stay with you forever. The community hall in Austin, Texas, usually reserved for potluck dinners and local celebrations, was abuzz with anticipation that evening. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the polished wooden floor, filled with families, veterans, and residents eager to hear Donald Trump speak. The soft hum of conversations and the occasional scraping of chairs against the floor set the atmosphere as attendees settled in for what promised to be a memorable town hall meeting. At the front of the room stood Donald Trump, his unmistakable presence commanding attention. His signature hand gestures and iconic red tie were familiar to everyone, yet tonight there was something different about him. His tone was measured, his demeanor subdued, perhaps reflecting the seriousness of the event. Amid the crowd sat 9-year-old Ellie, a petite girl with curly hair and wide, curious eyes. Dressed in a light blue dress, she looked out of place among the adults, clutching a worn photograph tightly in her hands. The photo showed a young soldier in uniform, her father, who had died serving overseas. Beside her, Ellie's mother rested a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder, quietly encouraging her. Ellie's gaze stayed fixed on the stage. Tonight wasn't just about politics or policies for her. She had a question, a deeply personal one that had been burning in her heart for weeks. And she was determined to ask it, no matter how nervous she felt. Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're watching from. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Ellie sat quietly in her chair, her small hands tightly gripping the photograph of her father, a soldier who had given his life serving in Afghanistan. For as long as she could remember, her mom had told her stories about him, how he believed in courage, kindness, and, above all, his faith in God. But Ellie struggled with that last part. If God was real, why would he take her dad away? It was a question too big for her to answer on her own, and one that weighed heavily on her young heart. For weeks, Ellie had been practicing the question she wanted to ask. She wrote it down in her school notebook, erasing and rewriting the words until they felt just right. At night, she would whisper the question to herself, trying to gather the courage to speak it aloud. Her mother had been her biggest supporter, gently reminding her, "If you truly want to know the answer, sweetheart, you have to be brave enough to ask." Ellie nodded, clutching the photo tighter. This wasn't just about her, it was about understanding something bigger than herself, something her father had believed in so deeply. Tonight she wasn't just a little girl in a blue dress, she was someone with a purpose, ready to find the answer to the question that had been burning inside her. The room quieted as Donald Trump stepped up to the podium, his larger-than-life presence instantly commanding attention. His signature red tie and confident posture were as familiar as ever, but tonight his tone carried a touch of seriousness, setting a different mood from his usual rallies. Trump opened with remarks on national policies, economic achievements, and the future of America. Polite applause rippled through the crowd at intervals, but the energy in the room felt subdued, as if everyone was waiting for something more. Ellie sat in the middle row, her heart pounding as she watched Trump speak. The polished words about trade deals and infrastructure faded into the background for her. Her focus wasn't on policy yet, was on the photo of her father, resting in her lap. Every time she glanced at it, her resolve grew stronger. She could feel her mom's supportive gaze beside her, a silent reminder of why she was here. After about 30 minutes, Trump shifted gears and opened the floor for questions. A line quickly formed, mostly adults eager to discuss local issues or praise his leadership. Ellie's breath caught as she watched them step forward one by one, speaking confidently into the microphone. She hesitated, shrinking back slightly in her seat. Her mother leaned in and whispered, "It's your moment, Ellie. Be brave." Swallowing her nerves, Ellie slowly stood, clutching the photograph as though it were a shield. The question she had rehearsed for weeks was finally ready to be spoken. Ellie's legs felt like jelly as she stood in line behind a group of adults. Each step forward felt heavier than the last. Around her, the room buzzed with low murmurs and the occasional claps for questions asked and answered, but Ellie barely noticed. Her hands were trembling as she clutched the photograph of her father tightly to her chest. When her turn finally came, the microphone seemed impossibly tall. A staff member adjusted it down to her level, and she looked up to see Donald Trump staring at her. His usual sharp, commanding expression softened slightly as he took in the sight of the small girl with wide, nervous eyes and a well-worn photograph in her hands. The room, which had been alive with chatter moments before, fell completely silent. Trump leaned slightly forward, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked. Ellie swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Her fingers gripped the edges of the photo as though it might anchor her in place. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Mr. Trump," she began, her words trembling, "my dad always said faith was the most important thing, but he died serving this country, and now I don't know how to believe anymore. If God is real, why would he take him away?" The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. For a moment, no one moved. Trump, a man known for his quick responses and sharp comebacks, was struck silent. His eyes flicked to the photograph in Ellie's hands, and something in his expression shifted his usual bravado, replaced by something deeper, almost vulnerable. The crowd remained utterly still, waiting with bated breath for what would come next. The room remained silent as Donald Trump stood at the podium, looking at Ellie with an expression no one had seen before: soft, reflective, even vulnerable. The photograph in her small hands seemed to have struck a chord. For a moment, the confident, commanding figure of Donald Trump gave way to something more human. He took a deep breath, gripped the edge of the podium, and began to speak. "That's a big question," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "And I won't lie to you, it's not an easy one to answer." He paused, glancing out at the audience as if searching for the right words. "When I was a young man, I thought I had everything figured out. I had ambition, I had plans, and I was determined to succeed. But life has a way of teaching you that you're not always in control. Sometimes it throws you challenges you never expected, and sometimes it takes away people you love." Trump's gaze shifted back to Ellie, his tone growing even softer. "When I was younger, I lost someone very important to me, brother Fred. He was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had this light about him, this goodness that I didn't fully understand at the time, but Fred struggled with his own battles, and no matter how much we tried to help him, it wasn't enough." He paused, his voice faltering slightly. "When Fred passed away, I was angry. Angry at him, angry at myself, and honestly, angry at God. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone with so much potential, had to be taken away. It felt unfair, like the world was playing some cruel joke." The audience was riveted. This wasn't the polished rhetoric or rehearsed lines they were used to hearing. This was raw, unfiltered emotion. Ellie's wide eyes stayed fixed on Trump, her small hands still clutching the photograph of her father. "For a long time," Trump continued, "I turned away from faith. I told myself it wasn't real, that it didn't matter. But then something happened. I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw Fred's face. He was smiling that big, goofy smile he always had. And I heard him say, 'Don, don't be angry. You've got work to do.'" Trump's voice grew steadier as he went on. "In that moment, I realized something. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's not about understanding why bad things happen to good people. Faith is about believing that even when you don't see the whole picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work. He looked back at Ellie, his expression softening further. Your father believed in something bigger than himself, Ellie. He believed in protecting others, in serving his country, and in having faith, even when things didn't make sense. And I think that's what faith is. It's trusting that the people we lose, the ones we love, are never really gone. They're still with us, in the choices we make and the lives we touch. Ellie's grip on the photograph loosened slightly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Trump's voice grew stronger, more resolute. I know it's hard to believe sometimes. I know it hurts. But your father's faith was a part of who he was. And I think, if he were here right now, he'd tell you the same thing Fred told me. Don't be angry. Keep going. You've got work to do. The room was completely still, every word sinking deep into the hearts of those present. Ellie, her voice barely a whisper, finally spoke. Thank you, she said, her tone filled with a mix of sadness and gratitude. Trump nodded, his gaze steady. No, Ellie, thank you. You reminded me of something important tonight. Faith isn't about answers, it's about hope. And you've given all of us a little more of that tonight. The audience erupted into soft applause, the weight of the moment hanging heavy yet hopeful in the air. For a brief moment, politics didn't matter. It was about connection, healing, and the reminder that faith could bridge even the deepest of losses. As the applause softened, Trump glanced once more at the photograph Ellie held so tightly. He leaned slightly forward, his brow furrowing as if he recognized something. Ellie, he said, his voice steady but curious, can I see the photo you're holding? Ellie hesitated for a moment, then slowly extended her small hands. Passing the worn picture up to him, Trump took it carefully, his eyes scanning the image. The room seemed to hold its breath as he studied it. Then, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that quickly deepened into something more profound. I know this man, Trump said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. He held the photo up slightly, showing it to the audience. This is Captain David Miller. I met him a few years ago during a visit to an army base overseas. He was one of the officers who escorted me during the tour. I remember him clearly. Ellie's eyes widened, her breath catching in her chest. The room buzzed softly with murmurs as Trump continued. Your father, he spoke to me about faith that day. He told me how important it was to him, how it guided him even during the hardest times. He said, faith isn't just for Sunday, it's what keeps me going when everything feels impossible. I remember those words like it was yesterday. The murmurs in the room grew quieter again, the weight of Trump's revelation sinking in. He looked back at Ellie, his tone softer now. Your dad was a remarkable man, Ellie. He didn't just believe in faith, he lived it. The courage he showed, the sacrifices he made, they were all rooted in the kind of hope and belief most of us struggle to hold on to. Now flowing freely, Trump took a step closer to her, returning the photograph with a gentle smile. You remind me so much of him, he said. The same strength, the same faith. He'd be so proud of you, Ellie. I know I am. The room was silent except for the quiet sniffles of those who couldn't hold back their emotions. At that moment, Ellie wasn't just a little girl asking a big question, she was the bridge between a father's legacy and a room full of hearts, now forever changed. As Trump's words settled over the room, the weight of the moment hung heavy. Ellie's tears glistened on her cheeks, her mother pulling her close in a quiet, reassuring embrace. But the atmosphere wasn't just focused on them, something deeper had shifted in the room. For the first time that evening, the barriers between the people in the crowd began to break down. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about faith, loss, and hope. A man sitting near the back of the hall slowly stood, raising his hand. He was rugged, his face lined with years of hard work. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice steady but raw, "I've spent years wrestling with my own faith. Hearing you talk about it, hearing her question, it makes me wonder if all of us are just too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem?" Trump paused, his gaze meeting the man's. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but full of conviction. "Faith isn't easy. It's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes it feels like you're shouting into the void, waiting for an answer that doesn't come. But that's the thing about faith. It's not about being perfect or having it all figured out. It's about trying, even when you feel like you're failing." The man nodded, his face softening as he sat back down. A ripple of murmured agreement spread through the crowd. Then, an elderly woman near the front raised her hand. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "I lost my husband last year," she said, barely holding back tears. "Since then, I've been angry at God. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" Trump stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice dropping to a tender tone. "It's never too late," he said. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It waits for you. And sometimes, it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it finds you again." The woman nodded, her tears now flowing freely. Around her, others dabbed at their eyes with tissues, some reaching out to clasp the hands of the people sitting next to them. The energy in the room was no longer one of division or formality, it was one of connection. Strangers exchanged knowing glances, their shared vulnerabilities binding them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Ellie, still clutching her father's photograph, watched in awe as the room transformed. Her small act of bravery had sparked something much larger. It wasn't just her question that had been answered, it was a question that everyone in the room, in their own way, had been asking. For the first time that night, it felt like they weren't just individuals in a crowd. They were a community, united by their shared struggles and newfound hope. The room was no longer just a gathering of strangers. It had transformed into a space of shared vulnerability and connection. As the murmurs softened, Trump stepped back to the podium, his voice steady yet filled with a rare tenderness. "Tonight," he began, "we didn't just talk about policies or politics. We talked about something much bigger, something that unites us all. Faith isn't about being perfect or always having the answers. It's about hope. It's about believing, even when it's hard, even when it hurts." He gestured toward Ellie, who sat quietly with her mother, her father's photograph resting in her lap. "This young lady reminded all of us tonight that sometimes the bravest questions come from the smallest voices. And those questions, those moments of courage, are what keep us moving forward." Ellie's cheeks flushed as the audience turned toward her, their expressions filled with warmth and admiration. Her mother squeezed her hand, whispering softly, "Your dad would be so proud of you." Ellie looked up, her eyes glistening, and nodded. Trump continued, his voice growing more resolute. "We live in a world that often pulls us apart by our beliefs, our politics, our differences. But faith has the power to bring us together. It reminds us that no matter how difficult the climb, we're all on the same ladder, reaching for something greater." A ripple of applause began, slow at first but quickly building into a standing ovation. People clapped not just for Trump but for Ellie, for her courage to ask the question that had brought them all closer. As the applause subsided, Trump leaned into the microphone one last time. "Hold on to that faith," he said, "and share it with the people who need it most." Ellie smiled through her tears, clutching the photo tightly. Tonight, she hadn't just found an answer, she had found hope, and so had everyone else. As the room began to empty, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Strangers exchanged smiles, handshakes, and even hugs. Conversations buzzed with shared reflections, as if the evening had unlocked something deeply personal for everyone present. Ellie stood beside her mother, the photograph of her father clutched tightly in her hands, her face a mixture of relief and quiet pride. Trump, now standing near the edge of the stage, spoke into the microphone one last time. What happened here tonight wasn't just about a question. It was about what happens when we take a moment to look inward, to be vulnerable, and to ask ourselves what truly matters. Faith isn't something that happens to use, it's something we live. It's in our actions, our words, and in the courage to ask the hard questions, just like Ellie did tonight. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. If there's one thing I hope you take away from tonight, it's this. Faith doesn't always come easily. It's messy. It's hard. But it's also what keeps us climbing, even when the ladder feels like it's going to break. And here's the thing, it's not just for us. It's for the people around us, the ones who need hope when they can't find it themselves. Turning back toward Ellie, Trump smiled. Ellie reminded us all tonight of something simple but profound. Faith isn't about having the answers, it's about believing in the possibility of them. And in doing so, we find strength not just for ourselves, but for the people who look to us for hope. For those watching, this story is a reminder. When life feels heavy, when you're struggling to find purpose, take a moment to reflect. Ask yourself, what does faith mean to me? How can I bring hope to someone else? Whether it's through a kind word, a helping hand, or even just listening, you have the power to make someone's burden lighter. So tonight, take that lesson with you. Share your hope, your faith, and your kindness with someone who might need it. And remember, the bravest questions often lead to the most meaningful answers. If this story touched your heart, reflect on your own faith and consider how you can apply its lessons in your life. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire and connect us.